Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in Prime Minister's questions today, Boris Johnson was attacked on jobs, on healthcare, obviously COVID related, on devolution by the SNP. But probably the most remarkable thing was when he was unable to say that he had read the report that the government commissioned. This isn't like a separate report that someone else has made, that the government commissioned in order to tell them how to deal with COVID this winter. The Prime Minister hasn't read it. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, format I do these things in, as usual, Keir Starmer got to ask 6 questions. Ian Blackford of the SNP got to ask a couple as well. I'm going to end up talking a bit more detail about Ian Blackford's in another video, I suspect, as well. But Keir Starmer's first of all. So his first one was focusing very much on jobs. He started off straight away by noting that he had supported many of the government's economic measures over the past few months. Of course he had, because the first thing that the government did when faced with an economic meltdown was to implement socialist policies in order to preserve a lot of jobs. And although there were holes through which a great many people fell through them, by and large it worked very well. It had broad cross-party support. But Starmer said the failure now to offer support where it's most needed, because the government are just doing this one-size-fits-all approach to furlough. They put it in, which covered everyone, which was great because everyone was knackered. But now they're withdrawing it for everyone, when actually there's some industries that are able to get back into it and some that are not. And this is going to be abandoning lots more workers and causing lots more companies to have to announce job losses, which indeed they are doing. And he says, you know, he talks about aviation in particular and the carnage in job losses there. And he says, if the priority is to protect jobs, why is the Chancellor not getting on with sector-specific deals? In other words, identifying that there's certain sectors in the economy that are going to need help for longer or more help. So the Prime Minister said for this that the Chancellor has brought forward support, which he said, you know, the Starmer supported. And he went on his usual thing. He's been doing this for a while now. Get used to this. This is just how it's going to be. He supported this and now he's attacking it, which is, of course, a load of nonsense. What Starmer is saying is, this bit we're supporting, but you need to do this as well. Do you know what I mean? It's a bit like if you have a broken leg or something like that, and you go to a doctor and they, give you some painkillers, but then they don't set the leg. And then you complain later on, well, you liked the fact I gave you painkillers. What's the problem? We expect you to get it all right, is the problem. And that's what he's deliberately failing to understand. And of course he's deliberately failing to understand it because he doesn't want to do the right thing, but he wants other people to think that Starmer is attacking him 1 minute and defending him the next on the same thing, which is not. So the Starmer, himself, was having none of this, and he stood up that this is, and he said this is rhetorical nonsense. He says it's perfectly proper and right to show where the support is for the parts of the package that are right and to highlight where it's lacking. And he said the Prime Minister should focus on those who have lost their jobs, not on the rhetoric. And he said on BA, for example, British Airways, they are, at the moment, this has been known for some time, it's quite appalling. So there's a lot of people going to be losing their jobs, but even the ones who are not, BA are using this as an opportunity to worsen conditions for the employees they wish to take on. So what they've done is they've basically said everyone needs to reapply for their own jobs, but it'll be on worse conditions. They are hoping that the current economic climate means that they're in a strong position to get employees to accept crapper conditions. And Starmer says, they're forcing through the rehiring of 30,000 of their employees on worse conditions. The Prime Minister himself, he noted, sent an email to BA staff where he said that the furlough scheme is not to be used to cynically keep people on their books. And he said, will the Prime Minister personally intervene here? To which Johnson says that we've been clear that we want our companies to support our workers. And he said, well, BA are in a very severe difficulty and we can't just use a magic wand to make sure every job is retained, which is not what it's been asked about. But obviously we get used to the fact now, we need to keep pointing it out still. Boris Johnson doesn't actually ever answer the question that's asked of him, unless you ask a bad question. And that's not been happening lately. He says, we are encouraging them to keep employees on with our investment programmes. And then he went on to his build for jobs, which I'm loving that he's coming up with this. I want him to keep using it because there's going to come a time when he stops using that slogan, and that's when opposition MPs need to start using it and reminding him and asking, well, what was all that about then? So then Starmer stood up and said, the Prime Minister knows perfectly well what I am talking about is the rehiring of 30,000 people on worse conditions. So again, exposing the fact that Boris Johnson is not tackling that. He was talking about, keeping employees on. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about basically scrapping their contracts. What BA are effectively trying to do is just sack everyone and then rehire a smaller number of people, however many they think they need, on completely different contracts, a much worse contract. Then Starmer talked about the report, which, talking about at the beginning, the government asked for. This is a report for the government. It's by the government's own advisory group. And it talked about a reasonable worst case scenario, including, the up to, I think it was something like 120,000 COVID deaths potentially this winter. Worst case, but a reasonable worst case scenario. Now, Starmer didn't talk about those figures, but he talked about the combination of a second spike and seasonal flu in winter. Obviously, that's always a big problem in winter in the NHS. Because the NHS is basically, at best, designed to cope when times are good in summer and not in winter at all. It never does cope in winter. And what Starmer noted, this report says what needs to happen in July and August so that we're ready for it. And he says what must be done is that we need a period of intense preparation in July and August, i.e. now. To which Boris Johnson says we are getting on with that investment. And he talked about the investment in the NHS. He says 12,000 more nurses and 6,000 more doctors since he became Prime Minister, which is true. That is actually true. Didn't mention the fact that the numbers went down during most of the Conservatives' time and have just only come back up more recently. But still, it is true that he personally has put more nurses and doctors in. It's still well short of what's needed, but you can't change that overnight. But he said it was down to their hard work that the NHS wasn't overwhelmed in spring, and that's why we won't be overwhelmed this winter. So that's important because what he did is he made clear that we're not going to be overwhelmed this winter. Important to remember. Now, it's not true that the reason the NHS wasn't overwhelmed was just down to the hard work of nurses and doctors. People are likening them to superheroes, but they're not. They can only do human work. What stopped the NHS being overwhelmed, I mean, it was very much all hands to the pump as well, which meant a lot of doctors and nurses were not able to do their normal jobs, which meant an awful lot of other people that they would have been treating were not treated at all. But what fundamentally happened is they kicked people out of beds in hospitals, elderly patients in particular, kicked out of beds, sent homes, which for many of them was care homes, in order to infect what was supposed to be a shielded population, result of which, about 40,000 deaths in care homes, I believe. Now, like I said, it's true there are more doctors and nurses, but here's the thing. They haven't sprung up overnight. There are more doctors and nurses. They were there for the first wave. But if there's going to be a second wave, combined with seasonal flu this winter, that's the same number. And there may be a few extra, as some of the student nurses complete their course by then, maybe, and are starting. There'll be an experience, but there'll be more, maybe. That's assuming people don't leave. We've got to understand at the moment as well that there's an awful lot of NHS staff were treated very, very poorly. Lack of PPE, worked too hard. If they're going to be looking at a winter, it could break people. So we'll see what happens there. But that's the concern. And then Starmer stood up and he talked about, what the report represents. And he says, look, this report is setting out what needs doing in order to avoid a bad situation in winter. So why won't the Prime Minister just promise to action all the recommendations? If the Prime Minister is saying that he's getting on with it, okay, just stand up and say, this is the report you asked for. Just stand up and say, yeah, I'm going to fully implement all the recommendations in this report. And in fact, I'm doing so now because now is the time to do it. Then Starmer said, testing and tracing capacity needs to be extended. That's in this report as well. It needs to be massively expanded, in fact. He says that track and trace is not working as promised. It must be expanded. What assurance can the Prime Minister give that the system will be fit for purpose come September? To which Johnson said again about, once again he attacks the system that is working on an unprecedented scale. Odd one, that unprecedented scale. Of course, it's unprecedented that we have a test and trace program in place for coronavirus because we've never had a problem with a coronavirus pandemic before, have we now, Mr. Johnson? So that's a pointless thing to say. But, he says many pointless things. I don't know why I'm harping on about that. And then he says, that Starmer keeps saying that the system keeps failing to tell enough people to isolate, but it's doing fantastic work. He said 70% of people have been found and told to isolate. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's not everyone then, is it? It's supposed to do it for everyone. If someone tests positive, this system is supposed to find out who they were in contact with, which it can't do because we don't have the tracing app, of course. Even then it wouldn't be perfect, but it'd be a lot better. But even given what it can do, it's still not getting hold of the people it knows about. 70%. It needs to be 100%. And because that's 30%, those 30% represent some people who've been in contact with them, some of whom very likely to have become infected themselves and are passing that infection on. We also know that actually most people ignore the rules to isolate anyway. So in terms of effectiveness, the isolate part has got to be part of that. And then Johnson said that our system is as good or better than anywhere else in the world. No, it's not, but never mind. It says, and it will play a part in ensuring that there will not be a second spike this winter. Again, so he's saying there's not going to be a second spike this winter. So then Starmer stood up, and this was for me the killer, and he said, the problem with the Prime Minister quoting that 70% is that it's gone down, because it was 90%. Whew. So basically, and Starmer was noting, basically the Boris Johnson has stood up and actually quoted a statistic which shows that this supposedly equal to the best in the world, second to none, system is getting worse. It's got worse. It's not getting better. It needs to be better. It's got worse. And then Starmer said, has the Prime Minister actually read this report? This report that tells the government what to do, exactly what to do over the next 6 weeks. The report that the government asked for. Have you read it? To which the Prime Minister stood up and said that he is aware of the report. So that's a no. This report that sets out what the issues are with our COVID response at the moment, clearly sets out what the issues are and recommends things to put them right. And it's realistic, the report as well. It's not saying, right, you've asked all this is what we should have, because obviously in 6 weeks you can only do so much. It's not pie in the sky thinking this. This is practical steps that are achievable in this period of time. And he hasn't read it. I mean, of course he hasn't read it. He doesn't read anything. And then Johnson says, it's up to Starmer to either get behind the government or not. And he says what he needs to do is to build up the confidence of people. So he's going on. And this is probably genuine. This is like right-wing thinking, isn't it? The problem isn't that the government have messed up every system so far. The problem is confidence. I mean, can't they see that? I mean, if just people were confident, it'd all be fine. And Starmer, he keeps knocking people's confidence in me. He's showing me up, and it's not good. It's not good for the country. You know, what he needs to do is build up the confidence of people to get back to work instead of knocking confidence in all these things. He says now is the time to decide whether to back the government or not. And again, I mean, Starmer didn't point it out on this occasion, but he has done it before, you know, standing up and basically saying, look, it's not for me to back the government, is it? For me to oppose the government, but I will support it when it gets things right. And why is he whining that the leader of the opposition won't back him? Even if he was getting everything right, I mean, a leader of an opposition has to offer some opposition. It's just at the moment it's bloody easy to do so. Then Starmer for his sixth question. Now, remember his sixth question. You won't be disappointed as well. He can't ask something that will require a follow-up. Boris Johnson is going to get up and grandstand. He did it last week. He did it again this week. He's going to keep doing it. He's just going to have a pre-prepared thing and just go on about it because he knows that Starmer can't come back on him on anything. So Starmer asked, he said, well, first of all, he addressed Boris's little whine and said that it's perfectly possible to support systems and still point out their failings. He said the attitude should be, there are problems and this is what we're going to do about them. That's what it should be, instead of constantly just trying to defend the holes. And then Starmer noted that he was meeting, and again, this is a perfect question to ask at the end because it's, you know, he said he was meeting a group that represented the families of those who'd lost loved ones to COVID. And he said that they are expecting the government to have at least learned lessons to not make the same mistakes again. And he says they will be listening to the Prime Minister's answers today. Starmer simply asked, what's the Prime Minister going to say to them? To which Johnson stood up and he said, well, he joins, I'm sure, the whole House in mourning everyone who has died from this epidemic. And he said he assures them that everything in his power will be done to avoid a second spike. So he's gone from there's definitely not going to be one to avoidance. Now, that was interesting. I'm not sure which one he meant. Maybe he didn't mean to be quite so clear-cut about there not being one this winter earlier on. And he says that's why we have an unprecedented test and trace, which actually now, thinking about it, isn't even true. It's not unprecedented. Because if it used to at least catch 90% of the people who'd been in contact with those testing positive, and now it's 70%, it's no longer unprecedented because it's worse than even the same system was a little while ago. So yeah, it's not even true, is it? It's still a pointless thing to say, though, when you've got a situation that has only just arisen a few months ago. And he says why we're investing more in the NHS, preparing the NHS for winter. And then he went into his grandstand thing about doing everything we can, banged on about Keir Starmer needing to decide if he backs it or not, went off on one about schools and the economic programme again, blah, 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 and he even brought Brexit into it. I was wondering if Boris Johnson was hoping that Keir Starmer would ask a question about Brexit, because it was asking for it, wasn't it? It was asking for it. I sort of suspected that he wouldn't, because, again, at the moment, it's much better to pin Johnson down on things that are not divisive in the wider population. And he says, you know, one day they accept the Brexit referendum and the next day they're against it. He's saying, like, today they're against it. Trying to bring that in. Again, I'm thinking maybe he thought Starmer would ask something about Brexit preparations. No. At some point he's going to have to. At the moment, no. Play the political game. And at which point, when he'd finished as well, the Speaker did have to remind Boris Johnson, because he was clearly grandstanding, he did have to remind him he's supposed to speak through the chair. Can you? Thank you. Then there was a Tory backbencher. I'm just going to sneak this one in for future use. So a Tory backbencher stood up, who represents a farming constituency in Buckinghamshire, I think it was. And he asked the Prime Minister if he will safeguard the high food standards that we already have, to which Boris Johnson said, absolutely, we're going to safeguard those standards. Don't be confused by that. That doesn't mean to say he's not going to allow in the lower standard food to come in. Remember what we've said before. The government's plan is to make sure that British farmers have to maintain the standards we have now. But if farmers, let's say in America, have much lower standards, they'll still be able to sell their produce in this country. So then on to the SNP. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this specifically because I think I will have to do a separate video on this issue. But tomorrow, maybe the next day, all depends on what the government are likely to announce. So Ian Blackford, leader of the SNP in Westminster, who was in the House today, it wasn't being done remotely, noted, and what he was asking about was something that obviously a member of the SNP is clearly going to ask about. It's very much about Scottish nationalism, as well as representing the people of Scotland. When those two things coincide, it's very predictable what he's going to ask about. And he noted that tomorrow the government is going to be publishing legislation to impose an unelected body to rule on decisions made by the Scottish Parliament. What he's referring to here are powers that were previously held in Brussels by the European Parliament, as we were EU members, now being repatriated. But instead of those powers being devolved properly, Boris Johnson is just trying to grab them all for himself. And Ian Blackford made the point that these decisions need to be made by Scotland's representatives in the Scottish Parliament. And he says we reject, for example, attempts for lower standards from one part of the UK to be imposed on Scotland. Now, this is a really tricky one. And again, I don't want to spend a lot on this because I could go on for some time on this one. Where? Obviously, Blackford had to make this point, but unfortunately, it's very, very easy to counter because here's where you've got a classic case of the SNP arguing against something, which I would totally be on their side with, but for the fact they're arguing against it in some other way. And Boris Johnson was absolutely able to point out the inconsistency. First of all, he said, on the contrary, what we're going to be bringing in is the biggest act of devolution in modern history, 70 powers to be given to the elected people of Scotland, blah, blah, blah. Which, this is why I want to wait for the announcement, because that's not what I'm hearing. But then what he said is what the SNP want are trade barriers, which is true. Because that's what the SNP are talking about. They are talking about trade barriers between England and Scotland. I'll go on about it in more detail in another video. And then what Johnson said is what he wants to do is give power back to Brussels, which is neither elected nor accountable, which of course is not true. No one in Brussels who makes any decisions, no one in the EU who makes any decisions is unelected, nor unaccountable. That is a Brexit myth that Boris Johnson is quite happy to bang on about because it helps him make the political point. So from that point of view, I mean, it was just too easy to bat away. Not that I blame Blackford for the way, because he has to do it in that way. It's just an easy one to bat away. Then he said that the Prime Minister, he was pointing out an inconsistency in Boris Johnson's position because this is two nationalists now going at each other. They're both inconsistent on this point. So he says the Prime Minister doesn't understand the appeal of the EU single market when he's banging on about the benefits of a single market in the UK. So this is also true. Boris Johnson is saying how there should be a single market in the UK, not individual trade areas. And yet he thought it was a bad idea to be part of a Europe-wide single market. Again, so that is an inconsistency, back and forth here. And then Blackford made the point that the government is undertaking a full-scale assault on devolution. There's a decade of Tory government that was rejected by Scotland, imposed on Scotland. He says, no wonder the First Minister, referring to Nicola Sturgeon, has 3 times higher approval ratings to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister guarantee that his plans will not be imposed on Scotland, that Scotland will choose? To which Johnson said it was quite extraordinary to attack unelected bureaucrats when he wants to give power back to Brussels who are unelected. Of course, is not true. But then he also pointed out that the people of Scotland did choose. There was a referendum in 2014, and that the SNP said that this is a once-in-a-generation event and that they should keep their promise and abide by that. Obviously, that once-in-a-generation event, we all know, came with the promise that we were going to stay in the EU. That was one of the big benefits championed by the Conservatives, of all people, for remaining in the Union. But there it is. As I say, some of those threads I could go on for a long, long time, and it'll be a separate video in itself. Tomorrow or the day after, like I say, it all depends on... I'm waiting to see what advance copy we get of what the government may announce tomorrow. If we get something that makes me confident I know what they're going to say, then I'll do it tonight for coming out tomorrow. Otherwise, it may be the next day. But it will be coming. So that was PMQs this week. I'm pretty sure there's one more. I think Parliament breaks next Wednesday. So I think there's going to be one more PMQs next week. After which it will be summer. They'll not be back until September. So there's that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.